Thanks a lot for joining me, Dr. Marandi. First of all, if you can give me your initial reaction to the events unfolding in Palestine.
Like everyone else, I was very surprised, but I think that, or I thought that this was going to happen at some point because the current situation was not sustainable. Ethnic cleansing in Palestine was picking up pace. The Israeli regime was violating the terms of the previous ceasefire. And at some point, there was going to be another crisis. But the fact that Hamas was able to carry out this attack and surprise everyone and to have such success in doing so, I think was probably the most surprising element of the whole thing, not that it actually took place.
Yeah, I mean, are you surprised by the level, the scale of violence from Israel? That it's leveling upon Gaza, that it's not just bombing different areas as it typically does in the last 15 years or so of these offensives on Gaza, but it's going into full-scale ethnic cleansing and talking about expelling the population of Gaza into the Sinai Desert.
No, that actually doesn't surprise me. I expected that. The Israeli regime has become increasingly fanatical, and their bombings they've done this before, but this is just more intense. So they've carried out genocide every 2-3 years in Gaza. They've killed hundreds and sometimes thousands of people. But this time was more intense, which I expected, especially with this current Netanyahu regime. What I didn't expect was the West to be so supportive of genocide, the collective West to be so supportive of racism, of apartheid, of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, the Western media to be so one-sided and supportive of the policies of the current regime. And frankly, it makes me feel that the West has gone back to the 19th and 18th century, where it views others as inferior and barbaric and subhuman. And I think there really isn't much difference between woke liberals and MAGA supporters when it comes to genocide in Palestine. Of course, there's a very large segment of American society that is completely opposed to this, but they are largely disempowered. So we see very good work from friends of yours and friends of mine in the United States, friends of ours in Europe, friends of ours in this part of the region. And of course, the international community is very much against and aghast at what the Europeans and the Americans are doing. I think the West doesn't understand how much, how little influence they have over global public opinion they now have. They seem to think that CNN and MSNBC and Fox News and the BBC and The Guardian, that they have the sort of influence across the globe that they had 30 years ago. That's just simply not the case anymore. So the global South, except for an exception or two, such as in India, they're looking with horror at what the Europeans and the Americans are doing. And if this is Borrell's garden, then I personally don't want to have anything to do with it. But one thing that I have to stress is that at this time of great anger among people across the global South, the Muslim world, is that the most active people in the West are really now putting their livelihood on the line. People like yourself and others, they're being shut down. Independent media is being shut down. And if they continue to raise their voices, it's not going to bode well for them. So there are a lot of people who are making great sacrifices, not like the sacrifices that the people of Gaza are making by any means. I mean, and that is also another extraordinary thing. One, that the people of Gaza have stood their ground, and especially the women of Gaza, because the men are in their tunnels and preparing for battle to defend the city, but the women are the ones being bombed with the children. But they're not fleeing; they're staying put. I mean, if they fled, I would understand, but they're not willing to flee for the most part because they know what the West wants them to do. They know what the Israeli regime wants them to do. They want them to leave, for many to die on the way out, and for the rest to leave and never return. And that's why they're not going to be tricked into leaving. So that is something I find extraordinary. And I think that history will remember perhaps the women of Gaza more than even the men who defended it.
Yeah, I think I mean the resistance, having spent 7 months in Gaza myself between 2014 and 2017, including during the 2014 offensive on Gaza. I mean, the resistance, the steadfastness, the dignity that Gaza displays is something that I've never really seen anywhere else in my life. I mean, even you see it throughout Palestine to a degree, but with Gaza, it's just more pronounced there because they're subjected to such harsh conditions. So it brings out this sense of resistance and also dignity because at least they've been able to establish their own sort of tiny bit of sovereignty, semi-sovereignty. They don't have Israeli, military jeeps driving through their streets in the same way that Jerusalem or the West Bank does, but they're punished for it. But the videos of people refusing to leave, of saying, you've killed my whole family, I'm gonna sleep in the rubble anyway, and you can drop another missile. That's what you want to Netanyahu and Biden and Europe. I mean, it's amazing. And I think this has really permanently exposed again, the R2P class here in Washington, D.C., the responsibility to protect, which is this hollow construct the interventionists, the warmongers created to advance their wars on Libya and Syria and other countries. And meanwhile, they're sitting quietly or outright endorsing and cheering on an Israeli slaughter and ethnic cleansing in Gaza. Of course, this is not separate from the geopolitical chessboard and the threat of the possibility of world war. There are many who would love to see some kind of intervention to stop Israel in its genocide in Gaza, which is a very complex and fraught dynamic. Chiefly, I mean, I think the first dynamic to look at is Hezbollah, of course, which is fighting back and forth, though not, it seems, at full scale with Israel in the north. And of course, Hezbollah is tied to Iran, where you are, so if you could, and Syria. So if you could maybe give your thoughts, I don't want to ask you to speculate, but what is the possibility of intervention? What is the possibility of this spiraling into not only a regional war, but even a world war?
First, I think that it's important to keep in mind that the reason why the Israelis are not entering Gaza, or they haven't yet till this moment, and they may in the coming hours, is because they're afraid. So they're really in a very tight position. They're in a very difficult position because they've said they're going to destroy Gaza, level Gaza, with the support of the West, and commit genocide and ethnic cleansing. So they've basically put themselves in a position where they have to go in. Otherwise, they're humiliated. On the other hand, they know that Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the other groups are ready for them, and that they've been preparing themselves for years. And the Israelis had no idea what was about to happen, and they obviously have no idea what's going on under Gaza. So the capabilities that the resistance has in Gaza is enormous, and it's very well developed. And the last time the Israeli regime tried to enter Gaza, they failed. Now Gaza is much more powerful, much more capable. So I find it very difficult to imagine that the Israelis will be able to take Gaza. I think they will get a very bloody nose, and ultimately they will have to declare some sort of victory, and the Americans will have to say, well, we pulled them back and asked them to for the sake of civilians, to accept a ceasefire, and then we will move on to the next stage. However,
as was done as was done in 2014, for example, an arbitrarily decided day after 51 days of pulverizing Gaza to say victory. Exactly. So sorry.
Absolutely. And I think the number of people killed by right now within a week is now the equivalent of the number of people who were killed during that conflict that in 2014. I'm not quite sure about the numbers, but imagine how intense the bombing is now, even though 2014 was genocidal itself, but now it's so much worse what the regime is doing. But there's also another scenario, and that is that the war could escalate. Now, Hezbollah is much more powerful than Hamas and the resistance in Gaza. And it's very similar, the culture in southern Lebanon to Gaza. In other words, the women there are resilient, the elderly, the children, they are very steadfast people. They're not going to surrender their land. They're not intimidated. They are waiting. Many of them are really looking for the opportunity to hit the Israelis. I'm not saying that this is something universal, but if there is an escalation, the Israelis are going to be hit very hard from the north. Hezbollah has a far larger arsenal, a far more developed arsenal, a larger military force, and much greater land to maneuver in, and I'm sure many more underground facilities than anything you can find in Gaza. And then, of course, if the Israelis are going to be fighting on both fronts, that makes them very vulnerable to the millions of Palestinians who are in the West Bank, the Israeli Palestinians, and those Palestinians who want to come in from Jordan. It's not as if this is not the United States. It's not Germany. It's a population which is subjugating half the population. Half of the population in Palestine is Palestinian, and the regime is constantly trying to suppress them, whether it's in Gaza or the West Bank or their own Arab Israelis. That's where they're spending, they're spending their energy.
Right. So, just to clarify, inside Israeli-controlled borders. So when you're saying that, you mean inside Israel, 48 Palestine, the West Bank, and Gaza.
Yes. That's right.
If you compare that, yeah, roughly half of basically half of the population is Palestinian, half of it is Israeli, and that includes Palestinian citizens of Israel, et cetera. Okay, sorry.
Absolutely. All the territories, when you look at all the territories that are controlled by the Israeli regime today, half of the population inside those territories are Palestinian. But of course, they have, for the most part, they have no say in what goes on in that land. And of course, now we see genocide being carried out. And by the way, there are lots of people being killed in the West Bank, but it's not making its way into the news. Of course, it never does. But even in our part of the world where we regularly hear about the daily murders in the West Bank, we're not hearing about it because there's so much worse things happening in Gaza. But the killings in the West Bank have intensified. It's no longer like one a day. It's been much more over the last week. But if the war escalates, and I think the Israeli regime is going to have, it won't be able to control it. I cannot imagine a situation where the Americans or the Europeans can intervene and win. Why? First of all, Hezbollah is underground. And the whole philosophy of these tunnels has been, over the past couple of decades, is to deal with the overwhelming power of the Air Force and artillery of the Israelis in any battle. So Gaza is well protected, even as the Israelis are carrying out genocide. All of the underground facilities, the ammunition, the weapons, they're safe and sound, being used. The missiles are being fired. They're shelling the Israelis, and they're preparing for the Israeli assault. The same is true in Lebanon, but in a much bigger way. But besides that, if the Americans wish to intervene, then they have to accept the fact that they're going to lose Iraq. You already hear major Iraqi militias say that they will not tolerate an American presence anymore in the country if they intervene. What does that mean? It doesn't just mean American businesses. It doesn't just mean the American military. It means the U.S. Embassy, which is itself like a huge fortress. It is larger than the Vatican. So if you look at Iraq, if you look at Yemen, if you look at Iran, I mean, any conflict in Iran would create a global economic catastrophe, because all those bases that the United States has in the Persian Gulf, those countries that are hosting those bases would be seen as partners in crime, and their assets, their oil and gas installations will be gone. And of course, what country benefits enormously? The Russians, which are major oil producers. So the Americans would be helping their enemy in Ukraine and their global rival, but it would bring down the global economy anyway. But the point is that it's not something that the Americans can do and win. They can hurt Lebanon, they can hurt Iraq, they can hurt the region, but they can't win the war.
And we also saw that nearly happen when the United States, under the Trump administration, assassinated Qasem Soleimani and Abu Muhandis in Iraq. Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis in Iraq, and the U.S. and Iran traded blows. Iran responded, and it basically got to a point where it became clear that if Iran is seriously attacked, then it has the capability to destroy basically the global energy economy production out of the Middle East and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar, which are just directly across the Strait of Hormuz, right? So, I mean, the implications are enormous here, but.
Yes, that when the Iranians started firing missiles at the al-Assad base in Iraq in retaliation, the Americans could do nothing about it. The base was destroyed. And that was just a small taste of what Iran has. And if we accept the Western narrative that Russian drone capabilities are largely Iranian drones, and I can't comment on that. But if that is true, and if it is true that really the only game-changing weapon in that war so far has been drones, if that is true, then the Americans and the Europeans should beware, because this region, the Persian Gulf region, is full of key installations, oil and gas, petrochemicals, refineries, that the West desperately needs. And therefore, if there is war, the Western economies will fall apart. And as things stand, things are bad enough as it is in Europe and the United States, especially after the war in Ukraine. And while all this is happening, and while this war could escalate potentially to draw in Hezbollah or Iran or Iraq or Yemen, and we see the Saudis are distancing themselves from the West, they're condemning the Israelis, which is new. For example, in 2014, that wasn't the Saudi position, or in 2006. This is new and very significant. But in addition to that, we still have the war in Ukraine, which is not in the news, but it's happening, and intense fighting is taking place at a time when the Americans and the Europeans, their attention has been distracted. They're looking towards the East Mediterranean and West Asia. The eye of Sauron has moved away from Ukraine. So that makes things much more difficult, because it gives the Russians an added advantage in the war, and that is going to make it even more difficult for them there. So if there's an escalation here, it makes things even worse there. The Americans have bitten off far more than they can chew. And so, in my opinion, the Israeli regime has already lost. This is a catastrophic defeat for the Israeli regime. The world has seen them to be very vulnerable. The intelligence failure is just beyond belief, because this is not like an intelligence failure where the Americans didn't figure out what the Russians or the Iranians wanted to do, and they don't know what's going on in Moscow or Tehran. The Gaza Strip is controlled by the Israelis. It's surrounded. It's a small piece of land. They have spies there. They push people into poverty, and then they force them to become informants. They have all sorts of intelligence gathering capabilities around Gaza, but they didn't know what was happening. Those who say that they did know and they didn't react, I can't believe that, because the humiliation for the Israeli regime is far greater than any benefits it may have for someone like Netanyahu. Because this is not 9/11 for the United States. First of all, it's a different thing altogether. There's no link, because 9/11 was Al-Qaeda, which was a creation of the United States. It targeted civilians in another country, regardless of how horrible U.S. policy was. But striking a civilian target in New York was a crime against humanity, just like the American crimes in our part of the world. However, in the case of the Palestinians, because this is something that I've been hearing over the past week often,
right,
where they blame Hamas and say, yes, the atrocities of Hamas, the terrorism of Hamas is bad, but the Israelis shouldn't be doing this or that. No, I don't accept that narrative at all. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, all the Palestinian groups, they are the slaves. And they are struggling against an evil and illegitimate master. And this is like the slaves on a plantation who revolt against the master. Now, maybe the master dies, maybe his wife dies, maybe his kids die, maybe there's a party and people come over and some of them die. Some people may be innocent, some may not be innocent, but the issue goes far beyond the case of a number of people innocent being killed or not. This is a revolt of the slaves, and not just ordinary slaves. These are the slaves that own the land. They're not like African slaves who were taken from Africa and put on plantations in the United States. These are people who owned that land. The land was taken from them, and they were put in concentration camps, or in Gaza being the largest concentration camp in the world. And now it was like a jailbreak. And they were literally visiting the lands of their fathers and mothers. So there's no moral equivalent. There's no way in which we can condemn the Palestinians and alongside the Israelis. There's no moral equivalence at any level whatsoever. That doesn't mean that anyone has the right to kill innocent people, but the Israelis and the Americans and the Western media use these examples, which take place in all wars, the Second World War, the First World War, any war, even a just war, you'll find innocent people who will die. It's literally impossible, especially with the technology today and the way in which wars are conducted. It's literally impossible for that not to happen. But to take out a few examples and make a lot of lies, by the way, the lies of the fake news about the 40 beheaded kids, which is itself criminal.
Exactly.
Because they are trying to impose a narrative or an image of the victim which is false and which justifies aggression and additional punishment and murder. So those people who make the fake news, and those who spread it, they're just as criminal as those Israelis in the bombers which bomb those cities, because they're assisting them. So the fake news about raping women and all that, these are there to help carry out genocide. And I think that the biggest mistake that the Israeli regime has made is that it doesn't understand that the world today has changed, that the West does not have the influence that it had in the past, that the region is distancing itself from the West because even American allies or client regimes, they sense weakness in Washington and in Europe. And this is because of liberal economics. It's because of perpetual wars since 9/11. It's because of Ukraine. It's diminishing the power of the West. And Israel is not a strong regime. Israel never was a strong regime. It never was one of the most powerful countries in the world. That was always nonsense. It's a small regime that's backed by NATO, by the Europeans, and by the Americans. And if the power of the West declines, the power of the Israeli regime declines with it. So they're miscalculating. There's no way in which they can escalate where they win. If they escalate, they'll be hated even more across the world, regardless of what happens in the West. And the West is also diminishing itself further, because they can shut down dissent. They can close YouTube channels and Instagram accounts, but it's not going to make it go away. It's only going to make the West appear more undemocratic, more despotic, and more like the countries that they portray for us as their opponents. In other words, the images of Russia that we're supposed to believe, those images are actually now becoming images of the United States and Europe. Whether Russia is like that or not, that's irrelevant. Whether China is like that or not, that's irrelevant. Whether Iran is like that or not, it's irrelevant. But the same accusations that they've been making against everyone else, now that is the reality on the ground in their own countries, and people across the world are seeing that. So they are diminishing themselves morally, they're diminishing themselves militarily, they're diminishing themselves economically. And so under such circumstances, I think escalation would only make things worse for the Israeli regime.
Yeah, I think your analysis I agree with. I mean, when I think there's the point you were making about a slave revolt, comparing this attack from Gaza to a slave revolt, which these things are ugly. That's just the nature of it. But it doesn't fundamentally change the question of the power imbalance. And the fact is that Israel has kept almost 2.5 million people in a concentration camp for decades, under occupation, then under siege, bombing, killing, under drones, constant state of terror, in every way possible, dehumanize them and force them to live like animals. And then it has surrounded Gaza with the softest of targets, with these settlements and kibbutzim, and even some kind of rave festival where a bunch of young people who are guaranteed to be soldiers,
absolutely,
are not, maybe not in uniform, and there were military vehicles there, and of course Israelis are all conscripted into the military. So if there are young people in their late teens, early 20s, you can guarantee those are soldiers. To put those soft targets there is the fault of Israel, of the Zionist regime. That is 100%. So that is who is ultimately responsible for this. As much as no decent person wants to see any child harmed or any innocent killed. This is just the reality of the apartheid regime, reality that Israel has created. And we cannot blame the victims for doing anything they can to upend that regime. I want to ask you one last question.
Yeah, just one question. Just one.
Sure.
One thing that I'd like to add, and that you're exactly correct. But it's sort of like in the Second World War, where, let's say, the French resistance, and apparently the French resistance wasn't all that popular in France. A lot of people didn't want the French to resist the Nazis. Most people didn't, apparently, for a long period of time at least. But it's as if the French resistance, when they go and kill Nazi soldiers, they happen to kill the wife of an officer or a child of an officer. That would be tragic. That would be awful. But that doesn't change the nature of the war. The Nazis are the occupiers. Or if, let's say, in concentration camps in Eastern Europe, the officers of the Germans or the Ukrainians or whoever who are guarding those concentration camps, if someone attacks their homes, or if Jews or gypsies or whoever, a number of them escape, and then a few of the wives of these officers are killed during the escape, that doesn't change the nature of the slave master relationship in the concentration camp or in France or anywhere else. So by playing with propaganda, I mean, the Americans and the Europeans can fool part of their own population this way, but the rest of the world doesn't see it that way. They know what's going on in Gaza. They know what's going on in the West Bank, and they're not so much dependent on the West for all their information anymore. They can get their information from alternative means. There's not a monopoly of information like there was 30, 40 years ago, with all these countries on the rise, and especially when Western countries have been spending so much money waging wars and building bases and all that. So I think it's pretty clear, and I think also the West is very self-delusional. They're speaking to themselves, and they think that the rest of us are listening, whereas the rest of us are just looking at them with horror and wondering, how could these people talk like this? I mean, I know, and I'm not going to name people, but some of these people who've become very famous in recent years and who've been critical of the woke movement, and they've been giving sometimes pretty good arguments, they've become quite popular among a segment of society in this part of the world, the English speakers. And now they see that there's no difference between them and the woke. Or, for example, the spokeswoman for the White House, who is black, who is lesbian, who is trans, when
she's a self-identified queer. I don't think she's trans. She's self-identified queer Haitian American, the first to be the White House spokesperson.
Okay.
Yeah. So yes, but Karine Jean-Pierre.
Corrected. So she when she in response to a question about a number of Congress people, a very small group of Congress people who have a very checkered record, their calls for a ceasefire. What was the word she used? She said it was something not disgusting, but something equivalent to that. So these are, whether it's the MAGA or the woke, they're all apparently the same. They're morally equivalent. And so the rest of the world is looking upon the United States and Europe and saying, well, then, what's wrong with this? Of course, you know as well as I that many Americans and many Europeans are dissatisfied. Many Jews across Europe and North America are among the staunchest critics of Israel. Many Christians, many Muslims, many secular people are completely disgusted with the policies that are being pursued in our part of the world, whether in Palestine, whether in Libya, Iraq, and Syria, and so on. But in any case, the political elites, when Borrell calls his EU a garden, that's that's not the rest of the world sees this and can see the hypocrisy very easily.
Right. The old colonial language, like this is 200 years ago. Borrell's still speaking that way, and you're absolutely.
That's a good point. Actually, these people have gone back to the 19th century. The politically correct language that even those who've gone woke no longer accept as going far enough, that's all gone out the window. We've gone back to language and used 100, 150 years ago. The Israelis are speaking like something you read in the Heart of Darkness.
Right.
And no one is complaining about it. No one is protesting. It's all fine.
Right. Exactly. And I mean, it's been very revealing, as you were describing, for me watching the sort of populist right wing, a lot of the MAGA crowd, only a tiny percentage of them, or the medical freedom movement here in the U.S. that opposed the vaccine mandates and the COVID lockdowns. I mean, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of them in North America have all supported Israel in its genocide of Gaza. They've all fallen in with the regime that they claim to oppose. I mean, no shortage of irony, considering Israel used its Jewish population as lab rats. I mean, there's, a Pfizer head said Israel's like a laboratory for us. So, and then of course Palestine is a laboratory for Israel's weapons industry. So you see, how both populations are actually used, and then the Israeli public, the Jewish public, is used to carry out these fascist attacks against the Palestinians who are subjugated, and seeing the right wing here in the U.S. that is so anti-woke, and it hates identity politics, but it has fully embraced the most pristine example of identity politics in existence, which is Israel, a state for one single ethnicity, and it is explicit in that. It doesn't even have a pretense of multiculturalism or diversity or pluralism, yet they cannot see this total hypocrisy, I think, because they're simply poisoned by decades of war on terror propaganda or whatever it is. I mean, we could, spend time psychoanalyzing them. And then, of course, the liberals, the wokes, we love diversity, and all, refugees are welcome, and LGBTQIA2S plus and everything, except for, those savages.
Yeah,
they have to be
those
exterminated.
Palestinians should be exterminated.
Right. So,
and others who are like the Palestinians, obviously, when time comes.
Of course. So let me ask you one last question. What about Israel's nuclear weapons? Of course, that they probably see it as the trump card they have. We know about the Samson option, as they call it. And I've no doubt that there are elements among the fanatical regime that would love to drop a nuclear weapon on somewhere like Tehran. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that what is going to destroy Israel is inside Palestine itself. The regime cannot sustain these policies. It's not going to last, the regime in its current form, as it subjugates the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people have been empowered, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. And the neighboring countries are looking upon Israel in a very different light. In the past, countries were thinking about developing ties with Israel because they thought that the way to the American heart was through Tel Aviv. Now, the United States is on the decline. Its importance is diminished compared to 30 years ago. But more importantly, many of these countries looked at Israel as a strong regime that could support them, that could keep these families in power. But now when they look upon Israel, they see it as an extremely vulnerable regime. So they don't want to have anything to do with it. Thus, you see this complete shift in Saudi Arabia. And then, in addition to that, not only is the United States seen as vulnerable, not only is Israel seen as vulnerable, but Israel is despised so much more than before across the world. Forget the West, forget the CNN watchers and the New York Times watchers, and that across the globe and across our region, the hatred for the Israeli regime, for these atrocities, has intensified in ways that I think I simply just can't explain here, but you know as well as I. So the Israelis it's already a diminished regime. And as the West declines further, and it will in the coming months and years, the war in Ukraine, the stupid economic policies, the building conflict with China, they're overstretched, and that itself is bringing the Israeli regime down. So I don't think what's going to destroy Israel is any conflict with Iran. Israel simply cannot sustain itself, and I think that some Israelis will begin to leave the country, and those who want to go to Israel will have second thoughts, and many countries will not invest in Israel. Western countries don't have all that much money to invest in Israel anymore, but China and others, I don't think they're, after what they've seen, they're going to take Israel. They're not going to look at Israel like they did before. So I don't see a future for Israel. I believe that, like apartheid South Africa, it is going to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. When I was young, I was an anti-apartheid activist, both for South Africa and for Palestine. I'm sure, like many of your older friends, I never thought that the apartheid South Africa would just suddenly fall apart. I thought that this was going to be it was going to take a long, long time before I didn't think someone like Nelson Mandela would ever be freed from prison. I thought if South Africa was going to change, it would be years after he had died. So many things happened that were unexpected in South Africa. And I think that the changing world that we are witnessing right now actually makes me more optimistic that the demise of apartheid in Palestine and colonialism and the end of these atrocities ultimately is approaching, and hopefully decent Jews and decent Christians and decent Muslims can finally, at some point, I don't think this is utopian. I think this is quite possible. Sometime in the future, can just live in Palestine like anywhere else.
Absolutely. The rise of the multipolar world is happening, and there are bumps along the way, and hopefully that leads to a more.
And there will be dark, very, very dark days ahead. I'm not saying that for it to collapse under its own contradictions, that means it's going to be peaceful. And no, I think a lot of blood will be shed. I think what we're seeing now, we're going to see more of this. I don't know when and how much and how long the current stage will take. That darkness, I'm pretty sure will be with us, but I'm optimistic that it will end.
We'll leave it there. Dr. Marandi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.